It was a moment when I saw the structures upon which my once regarded truth was standing on started crumbling down, and I could suddenly see what has always been, but formerly, invisible to me. Waves of evolving streams, changing our regimes, our desires and our dreams, requiring us to transcend, to go beyond, to surpass, as we search for that new compass. And sometimes difficult to comprehend these changes, so we condescend out of fear for what we fail to understand. But we shouldn't descend, nor fall for hatred or fear, because it is love that is everywhere, is and was long before I became I, and will remain long after I am not I anymore, for it is I, merely a witness of this magnificent play that we call life. Yes, I remember so clearly that moment when I realized that there is indeed this eternal truth that I yet cannot grasp, but sometimes, in moments of clarity, it manifests itself through kindness and through creativity. A poem, a melody, a design, a gesture, capturing the infinite. And I, merely the instrument, the witness and the instrument. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dila El Filali. And Dina is a spoken word artist, as we just heard. But not only that, she's also the founder of Metric. She's an engineer, a trainer, a New Amsterdam Council member, and an entrepreneur. And we will continue the conversation with her in a bit. But first, I would like to welcome you to another episode of Designing Cities for All. Of course, that is our 2-year-long activity and research program in which we take a deep dive into designing products, places, and systems for all. This livecast today is part of a series of 3 livecasts, and it's called Transitioning Together. These livecasts are co-curated by Designing for Cities for All fellow Dark Matters Lab, and we're very happy that they will be joining us today as well. We'll talk about what it takes to design a climate-resilient and thriving future for all, and today, in this final part, in this final episode, we will take a look ahead at some of the areas of experimentation that we think cities would explore next. Dina, please join me here because we would like to continue our talk. But first, to have a deeper dive into what to expect today, we'll have a talk with Joost and Indy, who of course are from Dark Matters Lab. Joost and Indy, are you there?
Or indeed.
Good to see you again. It's our final time together, so that makes me a bit sad as well. Can you explain to us what we can expect today, what you're researching? Because you will take over from me at a certain point and you will lead the conversation. Have you got any goals in mind that you'd like to achieve today?
So I think for us, this is a sort of third talk. Third set of panels. And the first panel for me was about describing, having an honest conversation about the scale of the challenge. We talked about why, in reality, all the indicators are pointing at 3.5 degrees. Right? It started to talk about the scale of the kind of conversation that we're talking about and how cities cannot be defined by their boundaries, but they need to be defined by the systems that they're interdependent on. So it defined the scale, an honest conversation. The second panel and the second discussions, we're really starting to talk about the domains of, if we want to talk about solutions, how do we start to even talk about them in the right frame? So the first stage is actually, it's really critical. The biggest challenge we face is the construction of a social covenant for transition. It's too easy to talk about nice technologies and nice gimmicks, but the real structural issue is how do we construct a social covenant for a transition in cities, in places around the world. And that is, I think, becoming a real issue in an interdependent way. And within that, how do we deal with the portfolio, a system of challenges, recognize the system nature of the problems? And in a way, the third panel we invited you all here for is actually starting to be more hopeful, is looking at what that looks like. How do we become meaningful about that transition? What does it really look like? And too often we have, we've had a history of politicians declaring they're going to support climate change transition by announcing 2 million euros and going, right, here's a 2 million or 5 million euro fund, and we're going to do climate transition. And you recognize that's worth about 5 houses in Stockholm or Amsterdam. It's kind of irrelevant money to the scale of the transition. But also we know this, we have to start to think at a different scale. And everyone here that's invited is really part of thinking about that at different scale, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. So that's really the topic space for today.
Thank you so much, Indy. Because you mentioned the scale already, there are many pilot projects, some of them successful, some not. How do we go beyond the pilot projects, and how do we make that scalable? How can we broaden the scale of that? Joost, have you got some insights into that?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that we saw in the first session that we had together was how hard it is to think transformationally, right? Even the guests that we had who themselves said, like, we're being too timid, we're thinking about incremental change too often, found it actually sometimes hard to articulate a position of what really addressing these deep code challenges would be. And so we consistently have been asking for and speaking about what are some of the instruments, so the instruments and the settings and the investments that we really need to make structurally. And that's also part of what we want to explore tonight with the speakers, which is how do we go beyond these beautiful exceptions, because we think there is an infrastructure to be built that addresses these deep code challenges head on, and that can be about learning and new ways of learning together and really investing in that. It can be about new forms of governing the change together, and I know that Olga has a lot to say about that. It can be a new way of creating awareness through different forms of communication and raising people's cognizance of what is required at neighborhood level, but also at the scale of the city and beyond. So there are many instruments, and those are the ones that would go beyond the pilot project, beyond the idea that technology will save us, because it won't. It'll play a role, but it won't in itself play us and save us. And yeah, that's what we want to explore tonight. And we're super happy to have our 4 guests here tonight.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Indy and Joost. And like you said, we've got 4 guests here tonight, 3 of them in the studio, 1 on Zoom. And those are, we heard already, Dina El-Falali. Very welcome, a warm welcome to you. You're a sustainability and resilience trainer. And we'll start the conversation with you. And you're much more than that as well. But we'll dive into that later. Here at the table are also Barbara Wagensveld and Marjolein Pijnappels, both from Studio Lagmus. What Studio Lagmus does, we'll dive into as well, and I'm very curious what your scenarios for future will be and how scalable they are. And our final guest who will join us through Zoom is Olga Kordas. She's the director of Viable Cities and a senior researcher at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology. Olga, are you there?
Yes. Here.
Then a very warm welcome to you as well. Dina, to start with you, you're a multi-talent, as we already saw. I mentioned it before as well. You're the founder of Metric, engineer, trainer, New Amsterdam Council member, young author, and an entrepreneur as well. You've got time to do all that together. I would like to ask you, you believe that we live in a beautiful and a complex world, but nothing is what it seems.
No, it's not.
What do you mean by that?
I think, unfortunately, ever since actually the Renaissance, we dove into this Newtonian way of looking at the world from a reductionistic kind of way. And it allowed us actually to go with this whole industrial revolution, breaking down systems, building up, but also not taking into account that we as human beings are part of a much bigger systems that we are interdependent from. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually what I try to actually make clear, that nothing is really what it seems. It's beautiful, complex systems. There's like self-similarity in fractal patterns on different layers to see, actually, and to be curious about. And what we see, I don't know if you had another question, but that's like, with regard to that, is what I mean about it, actually.
Yeah, the transition that we talked about in this triptych,
yes,
that's very clear for professionals what that means. But how can we support the ideas, the pilots that we just saw, and how can we broaden them to a bigger audience?
Well, actually, what very often happens is indeed you have small projects, incremental changes, and we want to actually upscale them. And for what happens very often, I think that was a bit lightened up earlier by Joost, is that as a professional, when you actually try to facilitate transitions, you're constantly in this unknown uncertainty that you need to deal with. The ability to actually be part of the ability to realize that at one side you're part of the system, but at the same time you're the problem, but also the solution. So there's no, unlike the Marvel comics, a villain and a hero, but you're part of the system that you want to change.
Is it possible? Is it possible to be part of a system and change it at the same time?
We are, actually. I mean, I drove here with an Uber. I chose an electric one. We're constantly actually keeping the system the way it is, the way we shower, all the behaviors, the routines that we actually have as human beings.
Yeah, you keep the system alive, but if you keep the system alive, because if you take the COVID crisis that we're experiencing right now as well, at the beginning of the crisis, everybody thought this is the right moment to have a bigger systematic change. We're reaching, hopefully, the end of this crisis. Nothing systematically has been changed yet.
Well, these kind of changes take really a lot of time. And they don't go overnight. They require us to be multidimensional, actually, to recognize the fact that if you want to change it, yes, like a disturbance like COVID could have actually really shifted things. It lightened up certain things. It shed some light on the political system, on the healthcare system, on quite some system, on the mobility system even, on the way we actually currently work. It lightened up certain areas that we could really dive in. But of course, a transition won't happen overnight and not even in 1 year.
I'm very impatient, so that's one of our flaws as well.
Yeah.
You've worked in a very wide range of projects. That was working labs, working with institutions. Is there something that, from your experience, that you can take away? Is there a common thread of a common theme that you can see that we can take away and use in a bigger context?
Well, the way actually I see it is that we want to change, but at the same time we should not. We should also be aware of that we should also create emptiness and spaces and conditions from which actually transformations can occur. And I think that's kind of at least the way I see it in everything that I did, whether it's a living lab or whether it was a community or a digital actually platform. You create spaces, environment from which actually change can occur. And I think that's where also a lot of solutions lay, which also means that you need to be very unjudgmental, recognizing the fact that the system that you want to change, be it the energy system and the mobility that I'm currently focusing on, with the applicability of hydrogen, you realize that throughout this whole chain, there are different actors that need to be involved, but at the same time, these actors are being influenced by multiple dimensions, the social, the economical, the governmental one, and all these dimensions need to be taken into considerations and vervlechten in het Engels.
You have to integrate them all
them in order to really make them collaborate.
But that's interesting what you say, because you have to create space. You need
to create space. You need to withhold the space as well.
And you have to be non-judgmental too.
Yes.
But still, we are very involved in an environment where everything's based on result. Everything is based on quick fixes. Is there room to create space? Is there room to be non-judgmental?
I think we need to create it.
I know, but something that you need is not always what you get. So how do you make sure that governments or institutions that you work with are able to create space?
Well, it depends on what kind of level you're working on. I mean, of course, on certain levels and on certain projects, the time frame is way shorter than on a higher level where you look at more programs and processes. So depending on whom you're talking to and what kind of level on, you have more actually zeggenschap.
More influence.
Influence to actually create the space. Yeah. So that's why you need to look at the multiple dimensions and the scale of it, and bind the right actually actors to the project in order to create the space that is needed.
Right. We will continue, or you will continue your conversation with Indy and Joost later. But first, I would like to introduce Olga Cordes to you, who is joining us from Stockholm. I have to say, a very hot Stockholm, I understood. It's very warm there at the moment. But Olga Cordes, you're the director of KTH Energy Platform, and you're responsible for facilitating interdisciplinary Energy Research at KTH. You also are the director of Viable Cities, and Viable Cities is the strategic innovation program for climate neutral and sustainable cities. It's the largest investment to date in Sweden in research and innovation on smart and sustainable cities. Tell us more about that, because we're very interested in the Viable Cities.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, very warm in Sweden, and so we know that climate and the weather are two different things. Then I believe we need to start thinking about the cooling systems and cooling solutions. And that it's also to keep the cognitive capacity for us to participate, for example, in this fantastic workshop today. So about Viable Cities, we are the strategic innovation program in Sweden, and our mission is climate neutral cities by 2030 with a good life for all within planetary boundaries. And this is to connect the climate action with people thriving and thriving of human beings as a part of the nature. Not so easy to reach, and we need to have systems transformation, and we could agree about that technological innovation is good, but not good enough. We also need a lot of collaboration. That's why Viable Cities is a membership organization with more than 100 members coming from local authorities and regions, researchers and universities from different fields. We have companies from different sectors, and we also have civil society organizations. And when working with the system transformation, governance questions are very, very important. So now I think that there are a lot of challenges, and we can share a lot of challenges of the governance and also the modes of multi-level governance that are not well developed yet. And I could say that we have still this silo blinded. If you think about municipalities and transportation departments, they would bring about some transportation solutions, not the solutions to minimize mobility. If you think about departments working with school food, it will be a lot about how we give students or the children nutrition and energy and how not poison them, more or less, but not about ecosystem services, not about the climate mitigation, not about mental health and physical health of our students. So, and then we have those silo approaches on very different levels. And also I think about the scope that Indy was talking about investments. So it's a short-termism in many decisions, both with municipalities and companies. So our municipalities are having 1-year budget plans. And then we need to have, of course, like long-term climate investment plans and large scale of investments. If you think about municipalities, our municipalities are having like 6 to 12% of all investments that are needed, and all other money are coming from private sectors, coming from companies, but also from us as consumers. So we need to collaborate, and we need to think about this kind of investments involving climate long-term investment plan involving many, many different actors. I would say also very interesting reflection about those pilots. I would say it's easy to have like pilots, kind of very even extreme pilots and showcases to retrofit one street here and one street there, to have one solution here and then. We have kind of amazing urban experimentations, but how to scale them up? And then we need to have a more kind of to connect those bottom-up initiatives to the top-down solutions and institutions, urban planning and so on, to change the modes of urban planning. And citizen engagement is very important, and we are talking about and doing different kind of dialogues, but not enough. So within Viable Cities, we develop a new instrument which is called Climate City Contracts. We signed the first Climate City contracts in December of last year, and we believe that it's our hypothesis is this would be a good delivery mechanism research, innovation, and the state commitments to cities, and it will also help to make transparent commitment from municipalities, but also other actors in the system. So in October this year, we will have 20 cities working with these instruments, and we need more of those. So all this we are doing is to not only to decrease the carbon emission and also bring more social sustainability, but just to create this dynamic capability of society to change. This is very important. So to create the platform for reflection and learning between cases, learning between cities, learning between different actors. And this is crucial for change.
Great. There's a lot of topics that you covered. It focused on governance as well, and it's important for all layers of governance to be in touch with each other and to communicate with each other. And you focused on how you can do that together, because that's an important way to go forward as well. One way is to make use of contracts, and the contracts forms a kind of a commitment in order to take that step together. So I'm sure that Indy and Joost will talk about that much more. Thank you for now, because it's very interesting that the topic that you just touched on, and I'm very anxious to dive deeper into that as well. We will return to you. Thank you so much, Olga. Here at the table, I would like to introduce Studio Lakmus, and we've got the two founders here, Barbara Wagensveld and Marjolein Pijnappels. You're the founders, and Studio Lakmus is a knowledge community agency with expertise in telling complex stories in a very simple way. Well, that's exactly what we need today. You both believe that we are never going to solve complex problems of our overpopulated, polarized, unequal 2021 world by aimlessly resharing multitudes of information and data, especially that last part. Enlighten me. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, we used to be scientists, actually. So we were, and still are, in love with data. We love to know and learn everything. But if there's one thing, I've been working as a climate change researcher, one thing I've learned is that with data alone, you don't solve it. If you tell people what it's like or how the system works, that's not going to incite people to change their behavior.
Can you give an example how data is being used right now in that way?
Well, with the COVID pandemic, obviously, still every day we get the numbers. It was we got a lot more numbers thrown at us a couple of months ago. And in the beginning, it worked because it also scared us into, listening to the rules and doing what was necessary. And there was a strong story accompanying the data. We have to make sure that the hospitals don't get overcrowded. And then in the second wave, the story wasn't as strong. People were struggling to find meaning and to sort of know what they did it for, because they didn't see in their own environment, a lot of people didn't see many people suffering from COVID, and they thought it is not that bad. So we thought about that a lot, because we are obsessed with information and data and how it's shared and what works and what doesn't work. And we saw sort of a big communication problem, a lack of a narrative that people could sort of bring themselves behind. And that's in climate change and all the big crises that we have, it's the case. The crisis with the best stories often have the biggest sort of, the people act on it. Sure. And of course you need data and stories, because stories, without that you get into the, weird theories that aren't based on anything, but you do need both. And I think that's kind of a mission for us to sort of see where we can help organizations in sharing the story, information-driven story. Yeah.
Talk about projects that you do and sharing the story. Andere Arnhemmers is a project that you did. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we're just starting this project, and this is actually it's about biodiversity, which is sort of the new buzzword. We started thinking about that because we are both biologists, and even we didn't actually know what biodiversity means or what is important about. When do you have good biodiversity? When is biodiversity not good? Is it about many species or only a few? And we started thinking about, there's so much going on in this field that people don't know about. We need to kind of show people that this is part of our actual world every day. So that's why we came up with Andere Arnhemmers. So this is Other Arnhemmers, and this is about not the other humans living in a city, but actually every other life form living there. So it's from the trees to the plants and even non-living, like rocks or anything that builds up our environment in a city. Besides humans, because
what was the reaction to that? Because it's very common to in certain circles, and here in the conversations that we had as well, talk about non-humans, talk about non-living beings, but to the Joe average in the street, I can imagine that that is quite a difficult conversation.
It is a difficult conversation. It's already very difficult to convince a town council that you should actually go with a title like Andere Arnhemmers, because they thought, no, people are going to think that this is about other people. And we were saying, yes, but this is why we need a title.
But how do you tell this complex story in the simple way that you pride yourself on at Studio Lakmoes?
We tell the story in a simple... Well, what we are doing here, and the project is just starting, it's actually making people realize, because, our connection to nature has become so veiled with all kinds of veils. Actually, Dina already told us also with the Industrial Revolution, technology, there are ample examples of children not knowing that milk is actually coming from a cow, not a supermarket. Yes, but this is what is happening. So what we try to do is get this nature back into our daily life, and for example, handing out apples, telling people this is made possible by an Andere Arnhemmer, which is the bee, or we have all these falcons living on our main church tower. You don't see them every day until you...
And what are the reactions from people if you tell them that story?
People are very amazed by actually the wildlife that is just living right under their noses that they never knew about. And that's actually, we don't do anything very special. We just show what is already there.
We're talking about scaling up projects. So is it possible that government, local government, will take this narrative and use Andere Arnhemmers as an example in order to change the narrative? Are they willing to do that, the more traditional institutions or governments?
Yeah. Actually, we talked about that in the car. We work with municipalities, but also provinces a lot. And like you said, they have to, but will they? I think they will. I think governments are also looking for a way to sort of redefine their roles with respect to the people. And it's not working anymore, laying down the rules and this is how we do it. People won't, accept it anymore. They have questions. I think that if they can take the role of showing people what's already there, making really tangible, like we're talking about climate crisis, and we're talking about, bees in the city, but they are all connected. And if you can show the little things that people know in their daily lives and that they actually appreciate without knowing, and showing them how that links to big things like climate change, I think that's sort of you need that sort of realization within a lot of people before you can do anything else. You need to have people know they are part of the natural system, and nature isn't where you go on holiday in Italy in the mountains. It's here, and not just in your garden. It's and on the pavements as well. It's everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that's an important, very urgent story as well. Well, my time with you is up. We're not at the end of the program though, because I'm going to hand it over to Indy and Joost. Indy, the conversation and the floor is yours from now on.
I'll go first in this case, and thank you to all of you. And what it strikes me is that the common thread through what you're saying is learning, learning and the building of new capabilities, and that involves, like I think, like Dina already referred to, a lot of unlearning as well. And we've told ourselves a series of stories that are relatively unhelpful in this age, and we need to become recognizant of a whole part of the complexities and new practices in a way that Olga spoke about as well. So so I have a question about all of you in sequence, which is to Dina. What investment do you think we need to make in learning, particularly around professionals that I hear also contact you from time to time, who are looking for new ways into this complexity, wondering what their profession really means, that are lost with what they've perhaps learned at university, and wondering how to go forward in the context of uncertainty, in the context of complexity, in the context of emergence, right? So there's one question. The second question about learning to Olga is how are you seeing that now happening at the scale of cities, at the scale of institutions? I know that you see these climate city contracts not as legal documents, but as a learning framework, and I'm really curious whether you're getting insights of how that is taking place. And lastly, to Barbara and Marjolein, what do you think communities, the communities that you work with, need to be able to do, need to be able to have as groups in society in a very uncertain age, where the uncertainties are, yes, they're conceptual, but they're also very practical. The risks we face are everywhere, from getting flooded to what happened recently with the extreme weather in the Utrechtse Heuvelrug. These are no longer theoretical or conceptual uncertainties. These are real lived risks. So what do communities need? And how are you working towards that? So that's my question to all of you. What is the learning capability that we need to create at different levels? And how do we invest in that? Because small projects, we know, don't do it, not at the speed and the scale of what's required. Dina,
Okay.
I would say.
Tons of information. I think the first thing that popped up in my mind actually is you need to also appreciate what's already there. The governmental structures, the current ones, the social structures, the informal ones as well, and also the ecosystem services that we are not completely aware of. And for me as a professional, personally, it means that you need to constantly try to see the whole system, appreciate the one that you want to change, and at the same time be constantly non-systems blind. So constantly realize, okay, this is only part of a bigger system, the one that I need to change. And with that in mind, I try, like I said earlier, try to create spaces, be it a living lab, be it a digital platform, be it a community, be it a certain research that I conducted in collaboration, but constantly actually trying to create this liminal spaces, this in-between spaces from which, like a cocoon, from which transition can actually occur. And that also means that in that whole process, you need to be okay with the fact that you will face a lot of uncertainty, that you don't know in advance, aside from that the current system is not sustainable and that we need certain changes in order to make the system more sustainable, but that you will face in the process itself a lot more uncertainty, and that you need to learn, actually, if it comes to the new kind of learning, how to deal with these uncertainty, how to remain actually centered throughout this whole process. I think that's a couple of, I would say, attributes, characteristics that are needed if you really want to upscale these projects and really push this transition forward. Probably a lot more. But for me personally, it would be really you have this split screen, being able to shift between the current system and the system that you want to change, dealing with uncertainty, and seeing yourself as creating these spaces.
And because what you're saying about creating these spaces for imagination, for exploring possibility,
Yes.
for experimentation,
For
is
people to be heard.
Indeed, and Giulio Quagiotto from UNDP, who we had in our first session, this triptych, also mentioned this point, right? With unlocking imagination, and empowering those professionals, those groups who have the agency to make the most of these spaces. Now, do you think the institutions that we have are starting to understand this? Are you hopeful about this, or do you think that that's a completely different shift or in scale in investment in this kind of settings is required?
It depends on what kind of...
Can I complement Joost's question? I suppose the other dimension of this question is, I think the fundamental inequality that we have, which is about precarity.
Yeah.
So 40% of Americans are living within $400 of losing their house. So when society is deeply inequitable, how do you create a just space for imagination? Right? There's a kind of deep justice and injustice already in play. Yeah. Long-termism is a privilege of the few rather than the privilege of the many. And in order for people to comprehend and be part of, we know this in terms of recessions, people make short-term decisions in economic recessions. Yeah. So we know the social neurological kind of effects of these systems. And also in terms of storytelling, actually the reality is when you're fighting in a short-term battle, your ability to absorb long-term stories is limited. So to make this transition, we almost have to create institutional structural justice to be able to have that equality of imagination. It's a kind of a mild provocation, Dina, in terms of...
I couldn't actually agree more. I don't know if it's a question, but I, for sure, like, only if and when this happens, and I think for those who are empowered to make these changes, these institutional changes to occur, need to also highlight it and make it possible for others to be part of it. And I think, I mean, I don't see it as a question, to be honest, more like a statement that actually I can only agree with.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, you see it constantly. I mean, I face it very often. That you see that there's also inequality in different domains, and I think that's one side of complex systems thinker, is that you realize that and you see that and you really try to bring that to the table, that, hey, there's like a whole group of people that are less empowered and are not contributing at the moment to this conversation. And the system that they're actually also that they are part of and that we wish to change.
And the last question, because you also have, if I understood correctly, the lived experience of what happens through your work in Amsterdam West, which is quite a few years ago now, of what happens when you act with a lot of purpose and share the tools that you have with communities and the stuff that gets unlocked there, right? So I know that you're speaking from direct experience here.
No, yeah, I mean, I was in Amsterdam New West, so we need to make a distinction sometimes in Amsterdam. It's a different neighborhood. But what I actually also really liked about the story of Lachmoes, the beautiful ladies, is that you need to actually, once I realized that you give these people the knowledge of how they're actually, and it was a very tacit, faraway actually system, and the energy system. We need to change it. It needs to be more sustainable. But these people have different problems on their heads, like low income, social houses. They're being from top down pushed to be part of these transitions that they actually cannot pay. They're actually also the ones that, how do you say it? Are the ones that have the least actually CO2 emissions if you look at the people. But still, like once you take them, once you transfer the knowledge and make them part of this change that is currently occurring, you realize that they have a lot to say and to contribute, and they really do want to change. They really want to become aware of the routines and their habits that are actually co-shaping these systems that we now try to change. So to go back, I think that it's actually the responsibility of those who are empowered to empower others with the right conditions, the right network, the right knowledge to be part of this systems change that we are actually ongoing at the moment.
Yeah. Absolutely. Indeed, like the transitioning can only happen truly together, and that's not just a slogan. It requires particular investments. Absolutely.
Yeah. So just to and it also means that you really need to realize that whatever you thought that was truth, and that was also in the poem, you need to let go of it and really try to understand where these people are coming from, and take that with you in order to really change it. Instead of looking at villains and good guys, and we're doing it together. Okay, sorry.
Absolutely. Now, from the next perspective, Olga, the institutional perspective. Again, learning is central to your work, and you're also making investments in that in order to enable cities and other institutions to do that learning together. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yes, I think first of all, Dina, love your poem. Thank you very much. Great to listen to you. Yes, so for us, I would say that Climate City contracts, in terms of learning, allowed normalization of the conversation about climate neutrality and also the human thriving and natural thriving at the municipalities and the municipality level. Before, if you would talk in Gothenburg and the municipality or Stockholm or others, this would be, okay, you're talking about climate mitigation or adaptation, go to environmental department in the municipality. It's their question. Now, our cities are saying that, okay, so when we are talking about climate mitigation, climate action, then it's a kind of different, all departments are involved, because we created also structures with the help of the Climate City contracting is process. So we also created the structures in all those different municipalities when all the heads of the departments and people at the departments, they sit together and discuss, okay, what does it mean for us? What kind of investments we need to do together? And this is not only for environmental department or planning department, but it's the questions that concern everybody. And if it was kind of surprising if people from school department would be at the same table for the conversation for several years ago, it's not surprising any longer. Then also on the political level, we had conversation of Climate City contract with different political parties, both with majorities and also with opposition. This is to get kind of a broader support to Climate City contracting and to get this kind of political commitment, because we worry, of course, that all these political changes are coming, and then this kind of Climate City contracts, climate action would be maybe accelerated or diminished depending on the majority. So this is also another type of learning that is happening. I would say also that we created the process for the Climate City contracting when it's not only municipalities and state, but it's kind of all the different actors at the municipality. So now we have also conversation between municipalities and between, for example, construction companies. So what the construction companies are taking for commitment. And surprise, some of the construction companies say, we have very high commitments. We want now to work with biomaterials. We want to do kind of to build a sharing facility for kind of city districts from the kind of build or design through the sharing perspective. And so they want to do it, it's committed, but the municipalities they didn't have any ideas that there are some commitments, there are some thoughts with the construction companies. So now I think that there are so many different conversations around. So it's not only, if we say that the Climate City contract is a paper or a very important document signed once, this would not bring probably as much learning as we have now, as it's a process in a Climate City contracts would be kind of re-signed and developed every year. I think also in terms of citizen engagement and different kind of bottom-up initiatives and involvement of different kind of citizen organizations. So now cities are, as they needed to write what they are doing, they really came back to us and said, you know what, we need to have kind of strategic project and to have conversation around what are those different instruments? How do we understand this engagement? Is it to support the change? Is it to drive the change? What are the roles of citizens, municipalities? In Sweden, we have very strong associations movement. You have associations for everything, for music, for theater, for art, for football, and everybody are in some of the association. Is it possible to use then associations as a driving force for transition? So I think that cities and different actors started to ask themselves questions. Okay, so how do we do this? We need to put it into the paper, into the action as well. So it's a lot of learning that is going on. But I would say this normalization of the conversations, that people are not surprised and not putting a finger on each other that it's you who are responsible and not we. So this is very important.
Olga, just one follow-on for me, which is one of the key dimensions that I mentioned it earlier, was this issue of the city. And often people talk about the local authorities. You've already said actually it has to be the civic associations. We have to talk about the city as a movement. And in one of those things, there's a real question about the boundary of the city. The kind of red line boundary of the city, and saying Amsterdam is this, or Stockholm is this, or Malmo is this. When we realize cities are networks of flows. So one of the challenges for climate city contracts will be to not only see the boundary, but the systems which make those cities viable. And how do you build those movements of pledges and accountabilities to really deal with that? Would love to just hear your thoughts about that, because Viable Cities is the city, but it's actually operating at a much larger scale as well.
Yeah, so we are already now talking about city regions, and we've been talking about city regions for a long time. And of course, you have some administrative borders, but you have also very different zones of influence of different actors. And that's why we're talking very much about multi-level governance. I mean, who is involved to solve which kind of challenge, or to drive transition in some particular directions. That's why it's more like we are not creating a central bank. So here we have a kind of central bank of knowledge, and we will feed the knowledge to administrations or different actors, but have a more of this network-based solutions and learning processes where this kind of system boundaries somehow defined by the scale and the boundaries of the kind of the systems that we want to change, and then to have all these relevant actors on board. It's not so easy, and we have very good examples where there are challenges that nobody is speaking on because it's not for the city. I mean, the question you had, very nice question about, okay, who is, for example, automation? If we think about autonomous vehicles, and there are a lot of experimentations, and we're talking about pros and cons and health scenarios and good scenarios. But the question would be if we have those kind of autonomous taxis, for example, what is happening to taxi drivers? I mean, so they would not have any jobs. And who should care about that? The municipality would provide their territories as a places, as a test beds for this new technology. I think that it's like many people would look for taxations for the parking, like diminishing parking places and so on. But who will think about this city? Who will think about what will happen with taxi drivers? So there are like a lot of different zones of influences, and there are challenges that they really don't have the problem owners, or the problem owners that feel responsibility to solve them. Yeah. And those questions, I think that for our program is kind of to highlight those questions and have conversation, but what should we do, and who are those actors that should take a lead and try to think about how to solve these problems.
Yeah, and what I've noticed is actually that a lot of cities are still relatively reluctant to recognize their role in changing food systems, for example. And so, like you say, problems without clear problem owners is an issue, and I think that's slowly starting to shift, but only slowly. And I think that's where your work is so important. And it's of course important to say that the Climate City Contracts is also something that is now being taken up across Europe by the European Commission and the Cities Mission Board, right? So may well soon be coming to the Netherlands and other places as well. And I think it's going to be really interesting to have the conversation further in the Netherlands about what those contracts could be and what they could mean. And that brings me to Barbara and Marjolein with that question based on your work. You work at many levels as well, right? Often in community settings, empowering communities with different tools in order to visualize, understand, re-understand their environments and what they're facing. And you, of course, work with institutions where you also equip them with different tools to understand, to communicate, etc. What do you think are the tools that communities are really going to need? Like, and are we actually, as a society, investing in that well enough?
Yeah, I thought about the conversation we had in the car here about looking at the system, control versus creating an environment where things can, well, grow, actually. And I think that, of course, there are many tools needed to enable conversations with people speaking different languages. For example, the scientists who have climate knowledge, who sit at the table with the people in the project of ours, people from the Vogelbuurt in Dordrecht, similar neighborhood, like you said, and where people really didn't feel included in anything the municipality did. And we helped organize a workshop where people could sort of visualize their, climate-proof street. But they didn't, start with that workshop. They really started collecting stories of people about what's it like living in this neighborhood. What are the stories of the neighborhood? What, and really they found so many links. I mean, Dordrecht is a city surrounded by water, and everyone had a water story, from their grandfather or their neighbor, and say they really used what was already in the community to create a broader community involving the scientists, and also a sort of a common language is something people say a lot, but it's really so important. We used to be scientists. We still work with a lot of scientists and government people, and there's so much jargon everywhere, even at this table, and you really need to make it concrete. So it's not maybe exactly an answer to your question, Joost, like what tools do we need to invest in? I don't have a really specific answer there, but I do think we need to invest in really building those connections and showing them the things that are already there, both through the scientists and to the municipalities and to the people what's already there, and connecting that and showing people how to work. Yeah, I see you want to say something.
Yeah. No, I wanted to respond because I think that what you see in society, we were indeed talking about it, like part of it is maybe also that we're kind of growing up. If you see society as a family, we're kind of growing up, and where institutions actually were, the mom and dad who would just say, we're going to do it this way, and the children would say, okay. Now we're sort of hitting puberty, and everyone is suddenly starting to ask questions. Why are we doing this? Why do we need to do this? I don't want to do this. Please explain it to me. And, there's this shift in roles, and this is, if you have kids in this age group, you will know this is very challenging and very scary, but this is what we are facing now, and the institutions need to take on this new role of a more guiding parent, or maybe explanatory parent, where we need to make room for the communities to, explore their initiatives, and maybe, things will go south and they need more help, but this is, I think, also part of this, learning to speak each other's language is also learning to adjust to these new roles of experts and maybe more practical experts like communities. Yeah.
And are you seeing that communities, where they are given that space and where those bridges are built, what are you noticing about how they respond? And what is it they need? Because I think one of the questions is also how do we enable them to make to be part of the investment, that are going to be made to make sure that these investments aren't going to be extractive in the sense of leading to further sort of precariousness, driving up costs for people who can't afford that. But maybe being made on a for-profit basis, extracting money and wealth out of communities. So in terms of economic democracy, alongside the process democracy, what is it that communities need, you think? And are you seeing sort of green shoots there? Are you seeing that out of these better processes also emerge new structures, new practices, new ways in which actually communities build towards a different future?
Yeah, I think when you look at the climate change adaptation projects that I was a part of at the beginning, 10 years ago as a researcher, and now more as a sort of intermediate guiding processes like this from a more practical government point of view, I do see that because people can translate the bigger things that are going on to their current situations, and also because they have built literally communities, like where scientists used to be, just a scientist, doing the research and bringing it out at the end of it, when they had done 4 years of research and a year of a publication process, and then the results were there. You see that now a lot of scientists, for example, have changed their practice to sort of share preliminary results, public, open access to journals, scientific journals is much more common. And you see also that the governments are taking this information also to shape their policies. On the other hand, citizen science or citizen involvement initiatives are much broader embedded, I think, in the whole system as well. I think that you do see that people find each other, but it's still, like you said, Dina, it's the sort of the usual suspects, the people that are already in a position of either power or money or knowledge that sort of bring this, and they only bring it to a certain aspect. And I think the people that are feeling the effects of climate change the worst are not just the ones who don't contribute to it as much, but also suffer the negative consequences much more. So it's really unequal, and I do think and believe that actually governments, like you said, the structures are already there. We should appreciate what's here and use what's there. I think the structure is already there, but there needs to be a shift within governments, and I see that happening already. That it's not just laying down the plans and this is how we do it, because you cannot create projects like that anymore. You really have to look at what's already there, what people want, and they will often say they want things that are maybe not practical, like the project we did in Dordrecht. People wanted an app that would warn them for flash floods, which is almost impossible to predict. You can predict it up to 30 minutes before, but that's what they wanted. But the interesting thing is, why do they want it? Why do they think that's the solution? And what is needed there? Is it, creating this app, or is it maybe looking at this old woman in the street who never has enough time to put sandbags for their house? And it seems like incremental, small-scale steps, but I believe that the big transformation needs to come from these small steps, and that the bigger institutions we have to guide this process and, pump a lot of money and resources towards that. And they need to sort of change their way of thinking from, we have all these rules and laws and EU regulations. That's what the conversations we have with governments, to looking at the bigger picture. That's constantly our thing, what we do. Like, go outside of that, computer inbox that everyone works and lives in, and look at the real world. And that's sort of, if you keep that picture in mind and make it as concrete as possible, I do believe that is what makes a transformation.
Before you intervene with your question, because I have to say we've reached the final seconds actually of this conversation. Time went really fast. So if you give you the floor for the final remarks, Indy, then I'll have to continue, unfortunately.
No, I was just going to. I think the big question it opens up for me is solidarity. Has to be beyond the street that we sit in. I mean, today, a city in Pakistan has reached 52 degrees centigrade to the point where it's kind of actually no longer viable for human life. There's 2 locations in the world that's hit 52 degrees centigrade with high levels of humidity. So the question for us is also community and solidarity at what scale? Because it's easy to build community at the level of your street. The question is, we have to build community and I often find sometimes the word community is problematic, right? Because community is who's in the community, who's outside the community. And maybe there's a real challenge here that for the first time in human civilization, we can't return to localization and the local community is a solution. We have to build a new solidarity, which happens both simultaneously, locally and globally in a new way, which I think is a really structural challenge for us in being able to address it, because there is a chance for the global north to save itself. But that would be a short-term save when we know there's 500 million people that will be on the move at the other end of the story. So how do we build this kind of new solidarity at a local and a global level simultaneously? Feels like a big issue. And actually our governments and our institutions really need to be geared for that. So I was just going to push a little bit on that idea of how do we construct that into a relational solidarity, I think is really key.
And how do you do that in communities, let's say in Dordrecht? How do you have those conversations where people already feel under pressure? Right? And which from their perspective is a sensible perception, right? Yeah.
Right. Like I said, time went really fast. There are many remarks made that are very, very interesting, and we should take time to think about that more and to talk about that further. Some of the remarks I would like to mention here. What you said, I thought it was very inspiring to be prepared to face a lot of uncertainty and embrace that uncertainty, because that's the only way to push that further. And you have to switch between different things, between the system that you're in and the system that you want to change, and you have to switch positions, which is very important as well. But in order to do that, you have to create space for imagination, create space for creativity in order to bring about new scenarios that you can use for that change. And you have to always be aware of equality or inequality. Who are the people in position to have a seat at a table to talk about the decisions that are being made about them, and how can governments prevent deciding about people and instead of that involve people in that decision making, because it's lacking in that as well. And that's the feeling that we have in Amsterdam New West, where people have the feeling that they're pushed, like they're used as a ball almost by government and pushed in different ways. And also another thing you said, which is very important, is realize that there are gray areas. There are no villains and heroes like in Marvel movies. But every area is gray, and that's important to know and to realize if you develop new scenarios. And what Olga says is that nowadays cities understand that you have to talk about climate imagination. What does that mean for us? And now all different kinds of departments are getting involved. So that's a major change, and that political commitment is very important, and it also extends to companies such as construction companies. But it's important to realize what the problem actually is and to define who the problem owners are, because that's the only way to make a solution and to go forward. And if you talk about the tools that communities need, that's what you said. You first have to define what the stories is, the personal stories are, and from there on continue to have a common language, to define a common language, and realize what's already there instead of creating something completely new, and connect the initiatives that are already there. And I love the analogy of society as a great family, and that we now are hitting puberty, where the governments should change, their ways of parenting. And I understand that as well. And that means also that process democracy is important, who is involved in the process, but in that case we should never forget the economic democracy, because that influences what part you take in that process. Listen to what people need, but also listen to what the question behind it is, because sometimes what they ask is not what they actually want or ask for or need. And you have to see the bigger picture. At least the governments should do that. And what Indy said, solidarity is key. Solidarity has to go beyond the streets that we live in. And community, we have to be very aware how we define community, who's included and who's excluded, and define a global community where everybody is involved. Those are the remarks that stuck to me. Joost, this is the third part of the triptych. What for you were the highlights or most important or key moments that you would like to take away or repeat?
Well, one thing to mention is that today we're sitting around the table with an engineer, a mathematician, a behavioral scientist, and a biologist talking about designing cities for all. And I think actually that's a really important realization, that the true transdisciplinary nature of this challenge requires us to rethink what design means, right? What it means to think about designing solutions. And we continuously emphasize new instruments of governance, new frameworks or scaffolds for learning, and the design of those and the purposeful design of different democratic settings, like was being discussed 2 weeks ago with Eva Rovers, right? Those are instances of design intent that lead to completely different places in which people can navigate and come up with solutions around the challenges that we're facing. And I think that's what I walk away with, right? And that's in the Netherlands, government, city governments, private sector, etc. Everyone is talking about transition, right? Everyone's talking about transitioning supply chains, transitioning technologies, even transitioning behaviors. We have relatively few discussions, I think, as a society about creating the settings through which this transition can genuinely, inclusively be navigated. And that requires, I think, an investment that we're currently not yet making, not just in the Netherlands, but more broadly. Neither in settings that overcome the obstacles, the mental obstacles that we have, nor the deep code institutional instruments that sit behind that. Right? And I think that's the key takeaway for me. That's where our design intent, our exploration, our experimentation, our investment needs to go. And I think we've seen really good examples here around the table today, as well as in the previous sessions. And I think that's what we need to work on going forward.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Indy and Joost. Thank you for sharing your insights and inviting all these guests. Thank you to the guests at the table in Zoom. Olga, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to all our other guests who joined us in our triptych. We've reached the end of this triptych, and Joost and Indy, I'm very curious because you're going to have that information, and as fellows, you're going to turn that into an essay, aren't you? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I didn't see that question coming.
I know. That's my job. Blindside you.
Look, in all seriousness, this is truly challenging material for us. I'm not going to lie. I think we already knew this, right? But through the conversation, I think we've seen articulated, and it's helped us to articulate a terrain of action and a terrain of exploration that also for dark matter is uncharted territory, right? And I think and that's okay. That's where we need to do work, and we're already working with Olga and Viable Cities on thinking how these climate city contracts can also have their translation at the local community level, and again see what kind of forms of articulating that new transition social contract, what forms that could take, right? That's hard. In full view of the precariousness and the lack of time that people have, et cetera, that's hard, right? That's not just conceptually hard, it's also practically really hard. And And I hope that our essay can start to articulate some of those tools in more detail, so that it's not just a conceptual reflection. Yeah, Indy, if you want to add to that, please go ahead. But I want to emphasize that this was a way for us to partially enter what was for us uncharted territory, and I think we're starting to do that. So that's been great.
Cool.
Right.
I'm just conscious of time. I won't say much, but I think for me the number one thing is how to have a truthful conversation. I think the thing that has worried me the most over the last year or so is that we've not really been having truthful conversations about the nature and the scale of the change that we're facing. Everyone keeps talking about 1.5 degrees when no military is planning for 1.5 degrees. All militaries are planning at 3.5 to 4 degrees. Most investors are starting to plan at 4 degrees. When you start to think about the future from the real scale of change that we're talking about, I think we have a different idea of what change looks like. And I think, so for me, one of the big takeaways of this whole gathering has been about starting to have that sort of scale of conversation, and then starting to talk about the real social dynamics that are required in that, the fundamental injustices that need to be addressed if we're going to deal with that scale of change. We will not transition this alone. We can only transition this together, in my view. Yeah.
Right. Very true, the statement that you made. And I'm very much looking forward to the essay. And I apologize for blindsiding you, but I think you managed to give quite a satisfying answer to that. So thank you so much, Indy and Joost. We've come to the end of this triptych. If you are a student or a designer to be, please join our student book club and get a copy of The Precipice. And you can find more information about that on dezwijger.nl/DCFA. There you have more information about it, where you can find online research files. And oh, well, if I'm blindsiding, I can blindside Indy as well. Indy, this is one of your favorite books. Why should people read it, and why should they join the book club? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think why we should all read it is because it's one of the first few books that forces us to think over a 1,000-year time frame. It forces us to institutionally think over 1,000 years. And I think as civilizations, we've been reduced to thinking to 3. Most human beings, if you look at the discount rates, they're 3 years, 4-year return cycles. Institutions think maybe 25 years, maybe. Democracies, 4 years. This forces us as a human species, as a civilization, to think about the next 1,000 years plus. And I think when you start to think at that different scale, you start to manifest in a different scale. That's why you should read the book. I have no commissions. I'm not the author of the book.
We are all going to read the book. And if you want to take part in the student book club, please send us an email at dcfa@dezwijger.nl, or you can scan the QR code that will appear on your screen in a moment. Well, this is it for this triptych. This is it for the fellows for now. If you would like to make a contribution to the programs that we make here in these dire times, that is possible. Please go to dezwijger.nl/pay, and there you can leave a contribution that will benefit the programs directly. Again, thank you for all our guests here. Thank you for watching, and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.